Folks, if you enjoy the show, why not take a moment to visit patreon.com/WW2podcast. Your contribution of $1 or $2 each month helps me to fund the podcast and find the time to produce the show. For those patrons of the show, I do try to give something back with extras and more World War II talk. So if you want more, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast and sign up to become a patron. Hello again. In this episode, we're looking at the giant Soviet T-35 tank with Francis Pulham. As you will discover, the T-35 was a peculiar vehicle with 5 turrets. Very few were ever produced, and almost all were knocked out very early in the war. Francis is the author of Fallen Giants, the combat debut of the T-35A tank. So thanks for joining me. Shall we start with looking at the Russian-German TG tank project? The T-35 was to come out of that. What was it? I wasn't aware of that.
The TG tank was the brainchild of Ernst Grotter, who was a German engineer who went to the Soviet Union under the sort of pre-Nazi cooperation to build tanks, because obviously Germany was prohibited of making arms after World War One, and a way to get around this was to send engineers to other nations where they could learn different skills. So obviously the Soviet Union at this point was looking at building up its tank armies after the Russian Civil War. So they embraced a lot of these German engineers with open arms. The Soviet Union is often misrepresented, in my opinion. The Soviet Union in the early 1930s probably had some of the best tanks in the world. They were certainly more advanced than pretty much anything anyone else was building. So the TG tank was this 2-layered machine which had a single 76mm gun in the lower portion of the hull. It had very limited traverse. It was almost like an early assault gun. And on top of this was another turret, which had a 37mm gun, and that could have 360-degree rotation. The Red Army at this point did extensive testing on the vehicle, but came to the decision that it was too expensive to make and a bit too complicated and ultimately unpractical, which is kind of ironic considering that the T-35 came out of this machine. They parted ways with Ernst Grotter, but they kept the prototype in the Soviet Union, and it actually stayed at Kubinka until World War II. Unfortunately, the records on what happened to it are lost, but there are photographs of it in 1940 in a dismantled state, but on display, so the guns have all been removed.
It's curious that they, with a German designer, they were going down this sort of, as you said, double-layered, I never thought of describing it that way, a route. It's like a turret on top of a turret, or I guess it's...
Well, yeah, I mean, the multi-turreted tank was a very popular idea in the late 1920s, early 1930s. I mean, the first tank to use multiple turrets was the Charles II-C tank out of France, which obviously had the main turret with the big gun in it and a small turret at the rear. But lots of other countries then copied that, and a lot of the work was done in Great Britain. It's often sort of misquoted that the T-35 is a direct descendant of the A1E1 Independent, which was the British 5-turret multi-tank. And while it's undeniable there are similarities, the Soviet paperwork states that they took one look at it and said they weren't interested in it.
What was the idea of... as you say, I think it's a good, like the World War II assault gun with a turret on top is quite a good way of describing it, but there's guns front and rear. Why?
The idea of this was ultimately that multiple turrets could engage multiple targets at the same time. From the Russian standpoint, the T-35 was something that they called a heavy breakthrough tank. So the idea with that is it isn't actually necessarily designed to engage tanks. It's actually designed to engage hard targets like pillboxes and bunkers. So if you're assaulting a line of fortifications, you'd send in your T-35s as the breakthrough vehicles. They would get behind the enemy, and using the fact they've got multiple turrets, they can engage multiple things. So what's a really common misconception is that the 76mm gun in the turret is used for anti-tank duties. That's not the case. That 76mm gun is for attacking soft targets and guns and pillboxes. The two 45mm guns are the ones which are actually designed as anti-tank weapons. They've got longer barrels, so the weapon is actually a higher velocity. And the machine gun turrets, self-explanatory. You know, the machine guns, they attack infantry.
It sort of fits into with that Russian tactic. Is it a deep battle tactic where you're fighting beyond the front line? So it's almost like you have all-round cover, I guess, with all these armaments front and back.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the idea. I mean, the Red Army had broken down their tanks previously into different categories. You had your heavy breakthrough tank, which was the tank that then took the brunt of the damage, but also dealt the most to soft targets. You had your medium tanks like your T-28, and they were more geared towards engaging other tanks. And then below that, you had like your fast cavalry tank, which was designed to exploit breakthroughs in a front line, also act as reconnaissance vehicles. And things like the T-26, which again were designed to, first of all, engage infantry because of the twin turrets with machine guns. But then when they were redesigned with 45mm guns, they could then also engage armoured targets.
I read, I don't know if it was in your book or somewhere, a description of it as kind of almost being a battleship on land, which is, I thought was quite an apt description.
Yeah, it kind of gained the name post-war, I think, land battleship. And there's a fantastic book, which isn't written by me, called The Land Battleship, the Russian T-35. Which is by Maxim Kumelitz and Jim Kinnear.
Yeah. Out of this TG project, we get this peculiar. It's enormous, isn't it? It's a really big.
Yeah, I mean,
for its time,
it was a very complex machine, and this is what I mean about Soviet tanks being sort of underrated. It was not just complex in a mechanical sense; it was complex in an electronic sense. And the T-35 and its sister tank, the T-28, shared a lot of features, but they were also very modern. The T-28, for example, which did predate the T-35, but only by a few months, had a rotating turret floor along with the T-35. And these were sort of the first tanks to try this. The T-35 had a very complex series of electronics inside the turrets. So when the turrets were turning, lights would come on for the commander of each turret to tell them when they were obscuring other hatches. This was the first time it had ever been done like that. And, you know, on a purely mechanical sense and size sense, we're looking at 9 meters long, and that's a big machine, and a lot of stress was put on it.
I was looking at it must have been Tanks Encyclopedia as a sort of a lineup of Russian tanks in 1941, and it's at the end of the list there, and in silhouette it is enormous. Weirdly, the profile, height profile, was not quite as high as one might imagine, considering it's got turrets on top of turrets. But its sheer length is huge.
It was certainly high enough. I mean, this is something that I bring up in my book, is how the profile of the vehicle was completely wrong. You know, you think of a modern tank now, and even tanks during World War II, the lower the vehicle, the less conspicuous it is. And you think you're looking at a machine which is 3.5 meters tall. Now, if you're a German observer and you're watching the Russians approach you, you're going to be seeing that machine from quite a way away. And in a purely practical sense, that's a big target for the enemy to shoot at. And because that's one of the reasons that the design was so flawed.
So Sherman tank, according to Wikipedia, so I'm happy to be told this is wrong, is a height of 2 meters 97. And how high was the T-35?
3.43 meters.
So it's only half a meter higher than the T-34, sorry, the Sherman. I don't know, which only has one turret. Yeah, which it's as I say, it's high, but considering it has two turrets, I didn't think I kind of envisaged it to be somewhat higher.
This is something that I also think is a little bit of a misconception. Is you look at the sheer scale of the machine and you think, wow, it's massive. But then when you see it in my book or online with pictures of either Russians or Germans, you suddenly get a sense of how cramped it must have been, especially like the smaller turrets. On the machine with no context, it looks massive. When you put people sitting in the hatches or standing on the machine, actually, it kind of is underwhelming. You're thinking, oh, actually, it's not that big. And this is a big problem with the machine, is it was very small and very cramped inside. You couldn't operate with.
What size was the crew?
It had a crew of 10.
Oh, just,
So, yeah.
I hadn't quite appreciated that. I've noted it down and I never got round to checking it. All right, that's a lot in as you say, it's a big tank, but.
Well, think about the poor commander. A commander of a normal tank has either 3 or 4 more crew members to coordinate. When you got 9 other guys and 5 turrets and a tank to drive, you've got no chance at all of controlling your machine. And this was another issue that was brought up with the T-35, and it's another reason that multi-turreted tanks were discontinued, was they were really hard to coordinate. You couldn't effectively tell each turret to do its job and what targets to aim for. You kind of had to leave everyone to it.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, isn't there, if with all that armament, and you've got to get through, and presumably it's all coming at you from all sides. And presumably the commander has to have absolutely 360 degrees vision, whereas in a normal tank you might just concentrate on what's in front of him.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, I focus quite heavily in one of the chapters on the book with the Battle of Verba. And in this battle, 4 T-35s engaged the Germans at a small village called Verba. And it's quite obvious, just in the photographic record, how much fire these things were under. Okay, it took a lot to stop them. You know, one of the tanks in particular made it all the way through the village, and it only was stopped by a Flak 88. But you look at the photographs of it, and it's just full of holes. At this particular battle, there were more tanks than just T-35s. You look at the smaller tanks, like the BT tanks and the T-26s, they ain't got a scratch on them. And this is a part of the problem, is if you're in one of the T-35s, you are taking fire from everything, because everyone wants the big thing to stop.
Yeah. Panic, it's the big thing coming at us. This obviously comes out of the TG project, and who did design it and build it?
It was a design team from the Kharkov Locomotive and Tractor Works. So it wasn't one person, it was a small design team.
Does that mean they'd knocked out trains in their downtime? Been locomotive works?
As far as I'm aware, before they manufactured tanks, they did manufacture trains. What a lot of people don't realise is there was actually 2 factories within the same complex. The KHPZ, which is the factory that made the T-35 and the T-34, and the HTZ plant, which before World War II manufactured agricultural tractors, and then during the war went on to manufacturing improvised assault guns on tractor chassis. And with regards to the Kharkov locomotive plant, as I said, it wasn't just one person who would have designed the machine. It was a team, the true communist way of looking at it.
Well, yeah, but in that true communist, you make an aspersion in the book about the is it the gear designer?
Yeah, I mean the machine was plagued because of the purges conducted against the Soviet high command and the Soviet population. So one of the examples I give is an engineer who was arrested and eventually shot because he quote-unquote disrupted production lines and other things like this. And when you read like the paperwork for the losses of the T-35, which survived the war, the amount of vehicles which lost due to gearbox failure, and you're thinking, you know, these men were being pushed anyway to try to manufacture a very complex machine. On top of that, in their working environment, they're being punished for nothing. So this guy was obviously trying to repair, or, you know, was designing gearboxes for the tank, and they weren't happy with his work, so they go out and shoot him. What sort of poor work environment is that? I mean, you think work today's bad.
Yeah, and they still never solved the gear problem. They might have been better off not shooting him.
Well, this is the thing, and it's a problem that didn't just plague the T-35. My next book, shall I say, is on the T-34, and the exact same thing happened when they were designing the A-20, which was one of the BT tanks that sort of led up to the T-34.
I mean, it looks like it's a relatively fluid design throughout the 30s, and you point out changes. I mean, is there a lot of changes up until the outbreak of war, which I guess solidifies things? But, you know, was there a lot of changes in any, say, perceived role, or did they figure things out? Or
change-wise, I mean, the actual role of the vehicle relatively stayed the same. However, by the end of the 1930s, it became abundantly clear the vehicle was not up to kit anymore. And there was actually talk about decommissioning them in 1939, which never happened, which is why we get to see the lovely pictures of it in battle. The actual physical changes of the vehicle were great. From pretty much the first chassis they produced, they made small changes here and there. And I actually chronicle all of that through the meat of the book, because the book is broken down into chassis numbers. You know, so the really early tanks had one hatch in the main turret for the commander. The clothesline antenna on the turret only had 6 arms. You know, in the next production batch, they changed that to 8 arms because the antenna would break quite a lot. You know, slowly more things were changed.
How big were these production batches? Because it struck me, you know, that there was quite a lot of. There seemed to be quite a lot of little change. So it's not as if they sat down and went, right, here's 100, bumf. It seems to be, you know, are they just batches of 10 and then they run 10 around and they go, next time out, let's just change this? It
was even smaller than that. We're talking batches no bigger than 7. In the book, I have got the tables of production, and the chassis were broken down. Obviously, they had a chassis number. And the largest batch is the first batch, which the chassis numbers begin with 148. There was 10 in the first production batch, but then after that, it doesn't get any bigger than 6 or 7. And most production batches were limited to 5 machines.
I don't know if that means it's a niche machine, or the Russians just weren't up for building a huge amount of tanks.
It was quite an expensive machine to produce, and ultimately, it kind of was, even in, you know, the early 1930s, a bit of a novelty. It was the only mass-produced multi-turreted heavy tank in the world. And I assume that the Soviet High Command didn't figure they'd need a lot of them. Obviously, because it was such a small amount of tanks manufactured, 59 tanks, 61 if you include the 2 prototypes, they could implement small changes that were really obvious. But a lot of the changes, which is why sometimes it's really difficult to identify a tank, some of the changes were done post-production. So a lot of the tanks were upgraded with new exhaust pipes, where instead of being on the exterior of the tank, they were brought under the armour of the tank, and you just had the 2 exhaust pipes sticking out of the body. And almost all the tanks had that upgrade done. So without knowing what other little key bits to spot, it can be quite hard to identify the machines.
So they were eventually issued to the 5th Heavy Tank Regiment in 1935. Do you know what the users had to say about it? Or has that been lost in the midst of time?
Yeah, during the 1936 summer manoeuvres, there were quite a lot of complaints made about the fact that debris used to build up at the rear of the drive wheel. Because if you look at the tank, to protect the suspension from enemy fire, it's got some side skirts. And unfortunately, mud used to build up on the rear of the wheel, and it used to cause damage. And that's actually something that Soviet engineers later addressed when, first of all, they manufactured 2 prototype hulls with the regular turrets, where they removed the rear portion of the skirt. They went back to manufacturing the old style of skirt for a little while longer, but then reintroduced it back on the conical tanks. But also in 1936, there was loads of other complaints, mostly to do with how unreliable the engine was, how hard it was for the commander to control the thing. And it's all these sort of reasons that I think that the T-35 wasn't manufactured in more numbers. Was they were trying to iron out these issues, but unfortunately they were issues that were always inherent with the design.
Yeah, something else you brought out was this. You know, again, when it comes to design, the Russians were trying to standardise chassis to repurpose. Is that right? They were trying to standardise them so they could repurpose them to keep down the number of chassis, presumably?
Most countries, I think I know what you're getting at, but most countries looked at what chassis they were manufacturing, whether it's Germany or Great Britain or anyone, and they went, okay, so how can we use this chassis for as many things as possible? So when they looked at the T-35, they said, okay, it's a fairly large chassis with minimal changes to the design of the hull and stuff. How can we adapt it to suit other roles? And the only other role that was ever experimented with was something called the Su-14, which is essentially a mobile heavy artillery piece. They only ever manufactured 2. one with a 203mm gun and one with a 152mm gun.
Beasts.
Oh yeah, they were heavy things, but the idea was as mobile artillery support. It wasn't direct fire, but they could get close to the enemy and provide some element of heavy fire support. It's a way of eliminating your artillery tractors. Now, unfortunately, through prototyping, it never really worked. But during the Winter War with Finland, they decided that they might experiment with putting these guns as direct fire support weapons. So what they do is they slap 50mm armor plates all over it and create a huge contained fighting compartment. But unfortunately, they never quite make it to the front to be used and end up sort of being left at Kubinka until the Germans arrive. Kubinka was never actually taken, but some sources claim they were taken out and used to engage the Germans at long range, but I find that kind of unlikely.
Yeah, I hadn't realised that there was such a forward thinking in trying at this point in trying to reuse chassis and come with the same thing. I didn't realise people were still that light on their feet about things.
Yeah, you'd be very surprised. A better example would be T-26 tanks. Obviously, the actual design of the tank changed over time as it was modernised. But on top of that, you had tractors which were made on the vehicles, anti-aircraft guns which were made on them. My favourite type of T-26 in general is a really rare little machine called a B-29, which was a T-26 chassis where they're taking out the engine, and essentially all it did was tow replacement barrels for the big Soviet howitzers over long distances. Like a really, really little niche, but this vehicle then filled.
Well, I did actually have a question here about, I don't know if you came up with the book, but this is a really big tank. What is it, 30 tons? Do the Russians have
50 tons?
50. Why? Do the Russians actually have the support infrastructure for that type of vehicle? Because it's enormous. I mean, you have to have something, a tank transporter just to shift it around. Heavy tank recovery for pulling them about when they get have a problem. I mean,
well, this is the thing. The short answer is no, they didn't. And this is one of the main reasons why so many of the vehicles broke down and then were left. The Soviet Union only had 40% of the tractors they actually needed to operate effectively at the beginning of 1941. And the problem is even of those tractors, pretty much none of them, without another tractor helping, could tow a T-35. The standard Soviet tractors which were used were things like the S-60 and the S-65 and the Kosmolets and Comintern. But all of these tractors were either too light, they couldn't actually pull the vehicle, or they were unsuited for the job. And as far as I'm aware, none of the T-35s that were lost in World War II were ever towed away by a vehicle which was specifically designed for towing. Unfortunately, the history has been lost to time, a lot of it. But the photographic evidence shows that at least one tank was towed by another T-35. However, the engine could barely pull its own weight, let alone two. So it didn't end very well, judging by the way that one tank's in a ditch.
It's sort of a bit of a design flaw of your thinking to design something, but then not design the infrastructure to go around it, just to shift the flipping thing about.
Exactly. And at the very end of my book, with the help of my co-author, Will Cares, we sat down on and analysed why the T-35 was such a failure. And one of the things we bring up is the fact that it doesn't have the correct recovery vehicles. And the way that the Soviet regiments are equipped in 1941 means that regiments had a mixture of vehicles and therefore had to have a mixture of recovery vehicles, fuel vehicles, maintenance vehicles, and it just completely muddied the water and made it almost impossible for a regiment to operate effectively.
We repeatedly have alluded to its performance in battle. So if we look, the Germans invaded in June in 1941, and by September, all that have been deployed have been destroyed. Is that because the Germans knocked them out? Or did it prove to be hopeless?
A bit of both. I like to give the tank more credit than it's probably due because I think it's a rather pretty little machine. But the fact of the matter is, photographic evidence linked with what's written in the table of losses of the 67th and 68th Tank Regiment, only 9 tanks were knocked out. Every single other tank, which we can find evidence of, was lost due to mechanical failure or accident.
So that's sort of 90% or something with mechanical failure.
I think it works out to about 75%. But that's an incredibly poor performance. As something we mentioned very briefly earlier, a lot of the vehicles were lost due to the same reasons. The 3 big offenders are gearbox failure, transmission failure, and drive shaft snapping. Not to mention accidents. At least 2 tanks fell from bridges which were just not capable of holding its weight.
Well, the Germans suffered from this as well. Some of their vehicles are just too heavy for the infrastructure of the time, and it's all very well building these whacking great things, but you've got to think about what they're going to be driving about on. And presumably,
as I like to say, the Soviets did it first.
And presumably, the Russian muddy roads would be just as bad for these monsters it would be for the Germans.
Oh yeah, for sure. The problem is as well, where the 67th and 68th Tank Regiment is deployed, they're in the 8th Mechanized Corps, which is in Ukraine, specifically around the city of Lvov, which is modern-day Lviv. At the time that the war happened, the infrastructure of Ukraine is nothing more than dirt roads. Even when you get into some of the bigger towns, it's still mostly basic paved streets and stuff. And this is really unsuited for a tank which is A, so heavy, and B, so maintenance needy. And a lot of the vehicles are lost because of this as a key contributor. Either the infrastructure of the roads wasn't good for them, or they just destroyed bridges, took up roads. It's kind of sad in a sort of pathetic way.
What happened to them once they were, I would say, knocked out? It's not, because they weren't really knocked out, but what happened once they were abandoned?
The Germans didn't really see much use in the machines. However, the majority of them were either left where they were knocked out or abandoned, or were simply just pushed to the side of the road. Those machines, as far as we're aware, because a lot of this unfortunately goes undocumented, were dismantled almost entirely by the Germans. I've got one picture in the book of chassis number 74467, which was the last tank manufactured, almost completely dismantled by the Germans in 1943. However, we now know that at least 5 tanks were used in the infantry anti-tank training role, which is quite cool, actually. So basically the Germans, after capturing a few of the vehicles, decided this would be a really good opportunity to practice and train anti-tank roles on real Russian tanks. And most of them were blown up, essentially, where they sat. So there was a repair centre at Sasnovo-Vizna, which is to the west of Lvov. Basically, anti-tank teams were given satchel charges and explosives and basically told, blow up the tanks, which they did. My good friend and colleague, Sergei Lotarev, actually owns the photographs of the Germans blowing it up. And it's kind of cool, but at the same time, it's like, oh, can you not? They're really rare. One of them was actually driven around by the Germans as a training vehicle and had keine munitions Gewehren, or whatever the word do not use ammunition is in German, painted underneath the Soviet Red Star, which is quite cool. And then one machine was actually taken back to Germany, and this is not really that well known, but the Germans used a T-35 in World War II. It was taken back to the German training centre at Kummersdorf, where the vehicle was analysed and German soldiers and officers were allowed to inspect the vehicle. Thicknesses of armour were measured and things. And essentially the tank was used as identification, basic training. If you pick up the Tiger tank manual and go to the page on tanks and identification, you'll find this tank in there. But at the very end of the war, when the Russians were on the outskirts of Berlin, all the tanks at Kummersdorf were taken out and used by the Wehrmacht. And luckily for us historians, one picture now exists of this T-35 in Berlin being used as an observation post and it's just been captured by the Soviets.
It's all well and good to sort of say, well, it didn't perform very well in 1941, but I mean, how did it compare to really the rest of its peers' performance in those early months of the war?
It actually performed about as well as everything else, which kind of goes towards the common thinking at the moment, which is the reason the Red Army failed so badly in 1941 wasn't because of the vehicles it was issued, it was due to its training and infrastructure. The thing is the Red Army was in a very poor state in 1941, and the Soviet High Command knew this. They were already going through massive restructuring, they were introducing new vehicles, but the problem is the basic training and morale of the Red Army was so poor that no matter what vehicle they operated, whether it be a T-34, a KV, or a T-26 or a T-35, they didn't perform well. They didn't know how to defend. They just threw their machines against walls of Germans, and unfortunately, many lives were lost and many machines were lost.
Was there anything carried forward from this design into future Russian tanks, or was the big lesson, don't do anything that we've done on this tank ever again?
No, the T-35 ended up being a dead end. What I find quite interesting about Russian tanks is how they all changed. All of the tanks of the 1930s, when you look at their ancestors, they all got heavier and replaced the role sort of above them. So fast cavalry tanks got heavier from the BT-7 to the T-34, and it went from being the light cavalry tank role to the medium tank role. The T-28 tank, its immediate ancestor from that is the KV-1. The KV-1 is a heavy tank, so it moves up the chain. The T-35 was a heavy tank. That never had any ancestors. It didn't go anywhere up. It was the dead end. One of the interesting things, which I don't really talk about in this book because it doesn't really affect the T-35, but in 1939, when the Soviet High Command are looking for new vehicles of the new generation, they are actually supplied with some multi-turreted tank designs again. One of them being the T-100 and the other one being the SMK. And originally, I think it was the SMK prototype, had 3 turrets, but this was quickly redesigned because they realized that it wasn't very popular. There's sort of a common misconception, and there's no evidence that Stalin ever actually did this, but the myth at the moment is that Stalin looked at the wooden prototype and took off the one of the turrets and said, "We're trying to build a tank, not a department store." I mean, it's not true. He didn't actually say that, but it is the thinking of the time. They realised that multi-turreted tanks were just wasting weight, wasting manpower, wasting money, essentially. So obviously they produced the SMK and T-100. They serve in Finland. They don't do very well compared to the KV-1. End of story. Multi-turreted tanks say goodbye.
How many survived the war?
T-35's 1. And that machine currently is at Patriot Park in Moscow. It used to be at Kubinka. The museum, I'm not really sure what's going on in the museum, but the museum has split its collection between the 2 locations.
And how did that survive the war? Presumably it just never saw the war.
Yeah, that tank had a very boring but important role. It was a training vehicle. So just before the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, 48 tanks were deployed in Lvov. 5 tanks were back at Kharkov being repaired. 2 tanks were at Moscow. And I can't remember the top of my head. I think it was 5 tanks were at the Saratov Tank School. Saratov is sort of northeast of Stalingrad, for some contextual. Now, the tanks at Saratov were primarily used as training vehicles, and as far as we're aware, they didn't see active service. However, this is where the mystery is. Yeah, there was a few tanks at Saratov, but only one of the 3 or 4 or 5 they had actually survived the war. So what happened to the rest? Did they actually go away and fight and they just were never recorded as such? Or were they scrapped towards the end of the war because they weren't needed anymore? Out of all this, 1 tank survived. It was brought back to Kubinka in 1946, and there's some pictures floating around of it, like next to Panther tanks and stuff, and it looks quite antiquated compared to that.
I have to say I couldn't believe that you'd unearthed so many pictures and then that you could put the chassis number to the picture of the tank. I mean, I must have spent hours just staring at detail.
Yeah, I would like to thank a couple of very close friends and colleagues for that. I've already mentioned him once, a guy called Sergei Lotarev. He's been studying the T-35 for nearly a decade now, I think it is. He was incredibly helpful. He had already got a preliminary look, a list rather, of the chassis numbers and what he thought they were in comparison to pictures. And I joined his little group in identifying vehicles because he happened to email me out the blue. He was like, oh yeah, I noticed you've been collecting T-35 pictures. Do you want to share collections? By the way, here's information I know. And it just happened to be the information I was using as my primary source. And after talking to him, we ironed out some of the mistakes that he had already fixed. Plus, through speaking to him, we actually managed to sort of come to an agreement on a lot of the chassis numbers and what we think they were. It was also sort of nice discovering mysteries and solving them. So one example being, we didn't realise until not a year ago that some of the very early tanks made were sent back to the factory, Kharkov, and had their main turret redesigned. So instead of having one hatch for the crew, it had two hatches for the crew. Now this is actually standard after 1936. But we were finding evidence of it being implemented in tanks from 1934. And we sort of realised at that point that, actually, if you look really closely, you can see that this has been to the factory and been changed, and this is different. And it sort of all went to a bigger picture, which is really interesting.
So did all the crew have to only have one hatch to come in and out of?
Some crew didn't even have any hatches at one point. So, yeah, I mean, the driver had a hatch. There were two escape hatches in the turret of the 45mm gun. There's an escape hatch on the machine gun turrets, and the main turret originally only had one escape hatch, but that was later changed for two.
What you were saying before, this is where the internet's an amazing thing, managing to connect people. You're no longer necessarily slave away in some archive, and you can suddenly team up with people and draw all this stuff together. I wonder if there's any drivers left alive.
Well, this is something that me and Sergei have been talking about recently, because one of the pictures I recently acquired is of a chassis number 23435, which is a really interesting tank because it tipped upside down in a river. And the pictures are really rare because it was lost in some really obscure village. And not only really obscure village, it was strange. It was lost like 50 miles away from the rest to the south. And we was kind of like, why did it go that way? And you can follow like a direct route from the bases west of Lvov to where it was lost. And we assumed that it was split up from the rest and went its own way. I found out through Sergei that he knew who the driver was, or the commander, was, and found out that he'd actually been killed later in the war, but found his family online. And I don't know if he's contacted them yet, but it's something we're looking into doing.
Yeah, that would be fascinating if you could find one of these old boys and grab him before he shuffles off this his mortal coil.
One of the really cool things that happened a few months ago is I contacted the Facebook page of the village next to where that tank was lost, because me and Sergei were trying to work out where it was lost. When trying to discover locations, the best source is actually the photographs that Germans took, because on the back they would normally leave a general location, and on the back of this particular picture it said Russian tank by Styry in Galicia. And Galicia is the old name for that area of Ukraine. And Styry, I'm saying the name completely wrong, I promise. Styry is quite a large city south of Lvov. And we knew that this tank was this chassis number because in the table of losses it says tipped upside down in a river. So we'd already sort of narrowed it down that way. We then looked at the name of the village in the table of losses where it says it's lost, which is Ivash Kontoy. I'm really sorry. Cannot pronounce. I can write these names, but I can't pronounce them.
Murder those Russian names.
Oh yeah, yes. So anyway, we looked up on Google Earth and we didn't find a direct match for the name, but we found one really similar. Now, we already know that the table of losses is wrong, just to confuse the issue even further. But it, generally speaking, has correct-ish names. So I contacted the village next to them, just to see if anyone had any information. And lo and behold, this woman contacts me and says, "My father went to visit that tank when it was upside down in the river. Would you like me to ask him about it?" And I sort of went, "Oh, yes, please. That would be really useful." And yeah, lo and behold, she sends me a Google image screenshot with a circle on it saying, "This is where he says it was. He went to see it in 1941 when it fell over, and he said that the Russians took it away and dismantled it after the war." And it was just one of those sort of, wow, I can't believe that just happened moments.
Yeah, that's how exciting. It just sort of fills in a little gap of knowledge.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, it started off as a complete mystery because all we knew was the incorrect name on the table of losses. And the problem with Ukraine as well, which is something else I touch, is a lot of the villages have the same names. So we thought it was a village all the way over at Tarnopol, when actually it's a village almost 100 miles or so away to the south. It was just one of those fantastic, oh my god, I'm discovering real history here. Kind of mind-blowing how someone's still alive and can remember going to see these vehicles when they were lost.
Yeah, indeed. Let's hope you find some more coming out of the woodwork. Frankie, thank you. Fallen Giants, the combat debut of the T-35A tank by Francis Pulham, is available now. As ever, I'll have a link to the book on the website, ww2podcast.com. Don't forget, you can find me on Facebook, WW2Podcast. Please give the show a like. I do post pictures and other stuff there in support of the latest episode of the podcast. So I think that's all for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.